Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to NPTEL's course on communication skills. We are now on module number 11, lecture number 3 on cross-cultural communication. This is also called as intercultural communication. At the beginning of the first lecture, I just started with a kind of introduction to this cross-cultural or intercultural communication. I also talked about the necessity of cross-cultural communication, followed by the benefits of cross-cultural communication. And then in the next lecture, I started talking about the conflicts in cross-cultural communication, which usually would arise because of the cultural variables or ignorance to the cultural variables. And then we started talking about the cultural variables, and under cultural variables, I started with one variable in the previous lecture. In this lecture, we will continue with the remaining variables of culture. And then we will slightly focus on minimizing the conflicts which usually arise out of the ignorance to cultural variables. Now, in the previous lecture, I was introducing this cultural variability which are under 5 dimensions, and then I talked about individualism and collectivism being the determining variable in terms of a culture that is promoting individuals in thinking, individuals in terms of psychic understanding, and at the same time there is another set of values prevailing in another culture which celebrates collectivism, which thinks that the collective interests are supreme than the individual, and so on. So, we looked at various countries accordingly, and then what are the advantages and disadvantages, and I also cautioned you by saying that there is neither a culture that is wholly individual nor a culture that is wholly collective. We can always say that this is high on the individualistic side and this is high on the collectivist side, okay. And then there are also cultures like the Norwegian culture where both of the values are kept hand in hand. And then we also find even in one country where one aspect of this culture is dominating, we also find some micro groups, micro cultural aspects which actually contradict. So, which means there is a collectivist culture, but within that there are organizations, there are micro cultural frameworks which actually nurture individualism. We need to understand this at a professional level so that we try to minimize the conflict that would come out of two persons, two groups who are in a situation where they are in a communicative situation, where while communicating they are bringing their individual or collectivist perspective across. Okay. Now, that was the way I concluded the previous lecture. Now, to continue with the thought, in this we will continue to talk about the second dimension, high-low context, followed by value orientations, and then power distance and uncertainty avoidance. Now, about the second variation, dimension to second variation is high-low context communication. What do we mean by high context in communication and low context in communication? Now, human communication depends on the context in which it occurs, and when we say high context, generally the focus is on non-verbal clues, which means when the context is very high, you find lot of non-verbal messages embedded in it, and much less is vocalized, said verbally, said explicitly, said openly. So, lot of meanings are implicit in a high context culture. So, one has to look for the subtext, one has to read between the lines, one has to look for the body language, one has to look at the environment carefully before determining the meaning in a high context culture. Now, the opposite is true in terms of low context culture. What is this low context culture? As it is suggesting, the focus is on verbal clues. Non-verbal clues available here are very less, or sometimes they are just suppressed, and you find verbal clues predominating. They are overtly seen. People who come from this context believe in verbal exchange of ideas, believe in articulating, syntactifying everything, including their feelings. So, there is nothing that cannot be brought in the form of word. Everything can be sentenced, everything can be brought in the form of paragraph, and the ideas can be communicated. Whereas, if you look at the people from high context, they would even be very comfortable with silence. They will be very happy that they are able to exchange ideas with minimum number of words or without words. People from the low context will be very uncomfortable sometimes when people remain silent, because they are not able to make out what is there in the mind, because the people from the low context are used to verbal exchange of anything that is transpiring in the mind or in the heart. So, when somebody from high context comes and keeps quiet, it is very discomforting a person from the low context level. This is the basic difference. Let us look at how Edward Hall defines these two dimensions. According to Edward Hall, a high context communication or message is one in which most of the information is either in physical context. Most of the information is either in physical context. Okay, it is tangibly available to you in physical context, or is internalized in the person, while very little is in the coded, explicit, transmitted part of the message, which means much of the coding is internal and very little, very less is explicitly transmitted as a message. Whereas, a low context communication is just the opposite, that is, the mass of information is vested in the explicit code. Everything is incorporated in the form of words, in the form of verbal communication. So, that is low context communication, and the basic difference you can understand between these two is, as I said at the beginning, the high context focuses more on non-verbal and the low context thrives on verbal aspect of communication. How do we look at countries in terms of high low context communication? So, barring exceptions, there are some exceptions, but if you remove those exceptions, high context cultures are generally collectivistic. So, cultures represented by China, Japan, North or South Korea, they all have a high context communication, high context dimension of cultural variation. This means the non-verbal component is very high here. Now, the low cultures focus on verbal context, and then they may become comfortable with verbal communication, but uncomfortable with silence. Examples: Switzerland, Germany, Scandinavia, US, UK, France. So, these are the places where verbal communication is given supremacy, and non-verbal, if it is used predominantly, can unsettle the people from this culture. So, low context culture suspects quiet people. Now, in a professional context, you can understand how a person from a high context will interact with a person from a low context. Sometimes it is said that some of the business transactions, persons from high context such as the US, UK, and persons from the low context, China, Japan, or the vice versa. Now, what happens when the persons come and interact together? The one who believes in non-verbal communication keeps quiet. The other who believes in the verbal keeps talking and is not happy with the other person keeping quiet. And sometimes the other person from the low context even suspects the person who is remaining quiet, who is coming from the high context, who believes in non-verbal communication. Apart from this, apart from high context, low context, the value orientations that people have, which come from the culture, which also sort of create a variation. What do we mean by this? The values generally affect intercultural communication. Now, in terms of intercultural communication, messages are guided by and reflect people's value orientations. The messages are actually guided by, on the one hand, and on the other hand they also reflect people's value orientations. So, like culture, values are learnt, they are not innate or universal. This means people are not born with inner values, values are given to them. Values are given to them through the narratives, through the documents, through social interaction. The narratives come to them even in the form of stories told by the grandmothers, anecdotes told from neighborhood, documentaries which are printed, available in libraries. Now, when the children, even the adult, when they keep reading this, when they receive inputs from these kind of materials, they imbibe the values. So, they are not born with the values, but then they imbibe, they nurture, they develop the values which are prevailing in the culture. Now, this is the reason why person from one culture will have one set of values and person from another culture may have a different or opposite set of values. So, values prescribe what is preferred or prohibited. So, one culture tells this is what is preferred in our value, and another culture says no, this is prohibited, and again vice versa. There are certain things which are universally preferred, universally prohibited in most of the cultures, but then cultures vary and accordingly they vary the preferences and prohibitions. Evaluative component as far as values are given, values guide in assessing what is right or wrong. So, this is another interesting and significant aspect of values, that is, it is used or the values are used as evaluative components. This means person with high values is likely to do what is right according to that culture. Person with low values is the one who will do the wrong things, or the ones are done by the person and would be treated as a criminal or unlawful citizen, because the person is not nurturing the values which are in the culture. Values trigger positive as well as negative emotions. So, some people feel that the values are worth following it up, some people feel frustrated, disappointed with the values, and then it can also generate negative emotions. Now, we can look at values according to some dominant themes, or the value orientation itself can be associated with some of the institutions such as family, and then we can just see how one orient towards it. So, let us look at the dominant themes of value orientation in terms of self, family, society, human nature, nature and supernatural. Now, first when you look at the self, if the context is from low context, the values which are nurtured in terms of self are individualism, youth, equality of sexes. So, which means there is no discrimination between male and female, all are treated equal, and doing performance, a person is valued according to what he does, what he has been doing, not what he has been talking about, not where he has come from. Emphasis is given on doing. Now, in terms of self, in high context culture, the values are interdependence as against independence. Old age, seniority has much more value. Male superiority, most of the societies are male dominated societies, and being, just the position, just the status itself can give some power. In terms of family, with regard to low context culture, the values which are dominant are individualistic, democratic, which means even in the family a democratic setup is prevailing and people believe in democracy, which means it is not the father or the mother who takes independent decision, or even if the son happens to be the only earning member of the family, it is not the son who takes the decision. Together democratically they discuss, they vote for it, they suggest, they criticize, and then they decide. Decision is not unilateral, it is open, no secrets, nothing is confidential, and high mobility. This means there is no factor binding the person belonging to the family to move out of the family, either in terms of seeking a job or even in terms of marital relationships. So, there is no binding that the person should go as per the wish of the family, marry according to the race, according to the religion, according to the culture and all that. Now, here high mobility is considered good because the person is allowed to make choice of one's own will and freedom. Now, in case of high culture, the family values and the dominant themes are lineal. So, this means it is authoritarian, there is a father, super father, or the great grandfather, then the father and the mother, son, eldest sister, elder sister, and so on. So, it goes with that kind of authority and it is prescribed. This means you have to follow some rules and no explanations are possible. It is not descriptive, does not explain why you should do certain things, does not tell why you should touch the feet of the elder when the person comes. It simply says that if you want to respect the elder, do that. It does not explain some of the religious practices. It says that if you want to show respect to God, do this. Low mobility. So, it does not generally nurture the individual leaving the family either in search of job or in terms of seeking marital relationships and leaving the family network and finding somebody out of the family. So, even that is not allowed. So, the mobility level is low here. In terms of society as such, in low context culture, the dominant themes and the value orientations associated with those dominant themes are independent, the society itself is independent, brief membership, few intermediaries. This means between the authorities, higher officers and the subordinates, the intermediaries between senior members and the junior ones, the people who operate in between are actually few, which means communication gap is very less and they do not have to go through various nodal officers, various nodal points to send their communication message. It's informal and it's mostly private. In terms of high culture, the society itself is obligatory, that is, you have to become a member. You cannot escape the norms of society, because you are living in society and you are part of that society, and it is a lifelong obligation. It is a lifelong membership. As long as you are there, you are responsible to the society, you are not seen as an individual. So, intermediaries are essential, because lot of communication gap is likely to happen. It is very formal and it is communal. So, anything you do as an individual to violate the social values, social norms, can generate communal riots, because the whole community feels that you are doing something against them, against the social values. Now, in terms of human nature as such, if you look at the low context culture, it treats human beings as rational, that is, you will be able to reason out things and you will be able to sort out problems by using your reason, and generally human nature is good. It does not subscribe to the theory that people are bad, people are evil by nature. It believes that people are good by nature. It believes that the God is within every human being. So, the person is by nature good. It may be the circumstance that is making the individual behave in a bad manner, but by nature the society believes, the culture gives a value that if you are able to train the person properly, you will be able to bring the good in that person. It generally sees happiness as goal. Change is encouraged, change is treated as growth, change is considered as part of the learning process, and one develops towards reaching happiness, towards reaching a higher degree and level of happiness. So, that is what is happening in terms of the low context culture with regard to human nature. With regard to high context culture, human nature itself is treated irrational. Man is treated as an emotional animal, as short tempered, as impulsive, as spontaneous, as a person who is controlled and chained by passions and emotions. Reason is there, but reason cannot do anything to help this person out. And why is that a person feeling like this at a particular point of time emotionally? Now, they say that it is beyond the person's control. And then why is it that a person is behaving in a very bad manner? The society believes that the person is inherently evil. It is not God, but it is devil that resides within him. Evil is within him, and life is mostly sad and unchanging. Happiness is not seen as the goal, it is seen as a kind of intermediary, it is seen as a kind of interlude. It comes occasionally, but life is a very long tragedy, and something that is fixed, something that is unchangeable, something that cannot be changed even if the person is able to use his reasoning capabilities. So, that is about human nature. Then about nature as such, in low context culture, humans dominate nature, which means nature itself is seen as a kind of benevolent servant to the man who is the master. So, man can make nature succumb to his whims and fancies, nature yields to his whims and fancies. So, he is able to dominate nature. If he wants to cut trees, he cuts, makes dam. So, nature does not have any woes with regard to this kind of development, because man is considered the dominant person here, and it is mechanistic in structure and always oriented towards future time. It always thinks of what happens in the future? So, okay, you are, let us say, cutting down trees now, but you construct a dam, and with the dam you also go for some power projects, and with that power you can serve lot of people around that village. You can also give lot of employment opportunities. You can also go for foreign exchange. The nation develops, the people develop. So, it thinks of future, not of what is happening temporarily at the present moment. In terms of high context culture, nature dominates humans. Now, human beings are treated as a very infinitively small, a very tiny particle of nature. Your one iota, one small microorganism, that is very negligible. So, nature is seen to be omnipotent, super powerful and all encompassing. So, it dominates humans and it is organic in structure. What is the difference between being mechanistic in structure and organic in structure? When it is mechanic in structure, you can, as if in a repair and replace mechanism, you can remove various parts and then replace it. In an organic structure, everything is integrated, every growth is related to every other growth, everything is related. So, you cannot cut off one thing and say that no, there is no hurt at this part and we can just ignore this and go to the other one. Every small part in the link is important. So, organic structure, growth is integral. Past time, it believes in valuing something that is traditional, something that has been happening for time immemorial, something that has been done for the past few ages and something that should be retained for the future. It does not think of making radical changes. Now, finally, the supernatural aspect of this, and then how the dominant themes are related to this in terms of low context and high context culture. In terms of low context culture, with regard to supernatural, humans are treated as God, that is, the human being has all the potentialities of a God to control, govern and organize his life as well as to pattern the environment. Now, in case of low context, life has material goals, it is worth achieving also, and there is belief in abundance. There is a belief that the planet Earth has so much to give, this abundance, great wealth, and one has to aspire, one has to struggle to get this wealth, and it is there for everybody. There is no need to compete with others, there is no need to belittle, there is no need to be in a competition with others with the anxiety that you get less. This group believes in the law of abundance, that there is so much. So, you compete with yourself and you get your lot. Cosmic order is comprehensible. This means there is a cause and there is an effect. So, you do something and then you get the effect. As you sow, so you reap. So, be careful about your planning, be careful about your implementation of your planning, you are sure to get the results. So, there is nothing invisible, nothing mysterious, nothing strange that comes to you and confronts you and take you unawares. The cosmic order is comprehensible, it is quite understandable. Now, in terms of high context culture, humans are controlled by supernatural. So, humans are seen as puppets in the hands of supernatural elements. Something God, something more than a God, something like a super God, something that is supernatural is controlling and governing the events of very simple ordinary mortals, human beings. Its spiritual goals are the ones which are followed as against the material goals which are followed in the low context culture. So, spiritual goals again would mean that you transcend the material goals. The material ones are necessary to survive at a lower level, but the spiritual ones are the ones which are required for one to integrate with the higher self. So, it may be the God, or super god, and it may be the level from man to superman, superhuman level. So, one has to reach this spiritual goals, achieve the goals to integrate with this higher self. Good in life is limited in this case, and it is often mysterious and unknowable. You never know when good things will happen, you are not sure of it. Often you are controlled by fate, it is not in your hand. Now, another interesting variable that happens irrespective of the fact whether it is high context or low context culture is the power distance. This means the distance or the absence of distance, that is proximity, that is maintained in individual or group relations in terms of power equations, such as the boss and the worker, the higher authority and the subordinate, the teacher and the student, the senior and the junior, the husband and the wife, the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law, the leaders and the followers, and so on. Now, inequality in relationships will be due to unequal power distribution. If the power is equally distributed, automatically equality will come. Inequality will arise when the power distribution is not equal. Also, all cultures have some forms of inequality. It will be very utopian, very ideal to dream of a culture that is equal. So, as George Orwell puts it, even in the very ideally utopian situation where all are supposed to be equal, it will soon end up in a situation where all are equal, but some are more equal than others. So, inequality, even in the best of equality where it is maintained, will thrive somehow or other. So, inequality will be there in areas as prestige, wealth, power, human rights and technology. So, the possession of technology, the right to use some technology. So, today it is believed that people who use internet and the ones who cannot use internet, people who use computers and the ones who cannot use computers. So, you can differentiate in terms of technology. So, the ones who use and then the ones who can afford to high end computers, high definition TVs, okay, and so on, and the ones who cannot afford to. So, it makes a kind of difference, inequality statement. So, power distance can be seen in families too. It will be prevailing in bureaucracies and even friendships. So, even in friendships there is often one friend dominating and the other friend being submissive, and then there are also very good and healthy friendships where both of the friends are equal. There is no domination in relationships, but power is possible, inequality is possible even in friendships. If you look at military organizations, they are generally defined by power distance, okay. Complete hierarchy, complete bureaucracy, absolute control is vested upon the one who is the topmost authority, and then equality reduces in terms of cadre, it comes lower, and the one who is lowest in the position has least power and treated the most unequal among others. Now, the next and probably the final variation that can determine the level of cultural conflicts is uncertainty avoidance. What does it mean? We all want to be certain of certain situations. We want to be very sure of some people whom we interact with, and when we are not sure, we want to avoid. This means, if you are used to one particular culture, we want to avoid people from another particular culture, especially when we feel that that culture is quite strange to us, we avoid. So, this is what we mean by uncertainty avoidance. the degree to which the members of particular culture feel threatened by uncertain or unknown situations. So, the degree to which the members of a particular culture feel threatened by uncertain or unknown situations is what we call as uncertainty avoidance. So, when uncertainty is high, that means when I feel threatened by somebody coming from another culture which is totally strange to me, when my uncertainty is very high, anxiety is high, and communication can be difficult, awkward, hence people avoid. So, that is the time we fret, that is the time we commit lot of non-verbal errors, that is the time we do something with the finger. So, do something unusual with the buttons, play with the hand, move here and there, shake, make lot of distractive body movement just to show that we are bit nervous, we are uncertain, we want to avoid the situation. Our body language itself is becoming rigid, controlled, frigid, not flexible, not open. We do anything to avoid the other person interacting with us. Now, that should be reduced. Now, how it should be reduced we will be discussing soon, but generally by reducing uncertainty, anxiety can be reduced. I said in the previous one that we look at the environmental variable in the next slide, but I think that before we look at the environmental variable, we also need to know the weak strong uncertainty principle that is prevailing among various cultures. So, when the cultures which have weak orientation, the individuals behave in a particular manner, in a typical manner, and when they have strong uncertainty orientation, again the individuals have certain other concerns. Now, let us look at how the people will behave. So, cultures with weak uncertainty orientation, uncertainty itself is seen as a normal part, it is seen as a norm, it is not something that is deviating from it, it is a normal part of life, and people are comfortable with ambiguity. So, people are not threatened by situation which will have more than one meaning, situation which is ambiguous, that things are not very clear, things are unknown, people are not threatened by that. So, in terms of school, the learning situation itself is open ended and the students are given open ended learning situations. In terms of office, that is organizational setup, time is a guide, but not a master. So, it is preferable that you follow a schedule, but you will not be crushed by that. Now, in cultures with strong uncertainty orientation, where uncertainty level is seen as very strong, uncertainty itself is seen as a continuous threat, seen to be threatening, seen as a continuous threat to be fought, and then one has to fight with that frequently. So, because of that what happens, the life itself becomes stressful and high anxious level is generated, and always audience, people who live there, the citizens who live there in the society have a certain level of urgency. They feel that this has to be done, otherwise something else will come. They do not know what else will come. So, they look for structure in business organizations, and in terms of school, teachers have all the right answers. So, it becomes some sort of teacher centered situations rather than learner centered situations in the previous setup. And the job itself, time is seen as money, time cannot be wasted, it is equated with money, and punctuality is expected. So, time schedule can even crush the people who are working. And another aspect of this cultural variation is to be read under microcultural context. Microcultural context. Remember, at the beginning we looked at a kind of layout in which culture is seen as the universally guiding governing principle, but under which we also saw certain microcultural context which may deviate, the cultural norms. Now, what do we mean by microcultural context? So, this is determined by groups of people who differ in some custom. This means the custom has something that is given by the culture as a norm, but then there are groups of people who differ in some custom, habit or practice from the general macro culture. Now, the difference can be due to race. So, for instance, if you look at the United States of America, and if you consider the Americans as the descendants from Europe, the subgroup will be the Afro-Americans who are there in terms of race. So, then the color difference comes. So, white and black. So, white and brown, okay, the South Asians, white and yellow. So, the color difference comes in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity, the ethnic practice, in terms of language spoken, in terms of religion or behavioral patterns. Now, they are also called minorities, subcultures or co-cultures. Now, minorities in terms of religion, for instance, if it is a small religious group, they tend to become minorities. Sometimes subcultures may be for the reason because sub has the meaning of inferior, lower, and these people sometimes form even if they belong to the same race of the majority of the citizens of the culture. Sometimes they have deviant habits such as addiction towards drugs, for instance. So, drug addicts form one part of the culture, but the cultural values say drug addicts are bad, drug addicts are not normal, drug addicts are not suited for organizational setups and so on. So, then the drug addicts form part of subcultures or co-cultures. Sometimes when one group of people who are not the majority, but who try to resist what is there in the main culture are also coming under the category of counter cultures. Okay. They have strong values, strong viewpoints, strong perspectives which are just countering, which are just against the main culture or main cultural norms. Now, Richard Schaefer defines minority. He says the term minority group is a misnomer. It does not refer to the size of the group, it refers to a subordinate group whose members have significantly less power and control over their lives than members of the dominant or majority group. This means minority is not decided by number, but rather than by power, rather than by the social structure in which they are operating. Now, coming back to environmental context, which I said at the beginning that we will get into. So, environmental context is quite interesting, especially in terms of cross cultural communication, because it prescribes when and what specific rules apply. So, while culture itself is giving some overall rules, while culture itself is giving some general pattern of understanding things, it is the environment that decides and determines how you can apply specific rules at certain points of time. Remember, in communication itself, I said that the environmental variable is very important, especially when we talked about non-verbal communication. I said that if a girl who sits on the corner of the auditorium suddenly comes and sits next to the boy who is at the center, need not mean that the girl is interested in the boy, because in non-verbal communication we say that proximity suggests interest. But I said that we need to look into the environmental variable, such as she has a cold, terrible cold, and the air conditioner is giving lot of cool air if she sits on the corner, such as she wants to sit near the podium, sits very close to the speaker and the only seat available was next to the boy, and so on. So, is the environmental variable at a very macro level, in which it also gives its own specific rules, which may correlate with the superimposed rules by the culture, or mostly resist and then give a different meaning and norm. Now, what does it include? It includes the physical geography. That means the entire nation itself can say something. When you go to United States, when you go to the Disneyland itself is prescribing a kind of geography, physical geography. And when you are inside it, when you are outside it, how you behave, how you communicate. Architecture, the way skyscrapers are determining one nation, and then let us say there is another country where hardly you find 5-storied buildings. Landscape design, how a garden is cultivated, what is meant as garden of national importance, and how many gardens are there in a country, and so on, in terms of landscape design. Even designing where the bus station will be, where the railway station will be, where will you keep airports, and where will people live, the town planning itself will all come under this landscape design. Housing, where to keep people, and then how many houses you will give them, in which place, etc. Perceptions of privacy. Can you intrude somebody late at night? Is it okay to call somebody at 12 o'clock, midnight, and so on. So, perceptions of privacy, time orientation, so which we again discussed before in non-verbal communication, such as the monochronic perspective and the polychronic perspective. Time is seen in monistic principle, time as a kind of flexible component in the polychronic principle, and even the climate of a particular culture. So, just quickly, even if you look at landscapes, architecture for instance, so if you look at huge tall constructions and then monumental beauties, and then places which are just noted for calmness, beach, etc. So, it makes a difference. Now, again in the environmental context, all human communication occurs within a physical and perceptual environment. Whenever we are communicating, we are actually in a physical as well as in a perceptual environment. Environment is very much there, whether you are inside the room or outside the room, whether you are walking with somebody near the beach, or whether you are sitting on the bench and talking to somebody in a garden, whether you are inside the bedroom, outside the drawing room, and so on. So, it depends on the physical as well as the perceptual environment, and these environmentalists have a pervasive influence on the nature of communication. So, these environments, the environmental variables, they have actually a pervasive influence on the nature of communication. So, for example, quiet room, a room that is very quiet, such as a very good library where silence is absolutely maintained, hospital scenario where it is silent, or just a very big office space where just it is silent, and a noisy railway station. How is the communication? When you talk to somebody in a quiet room and when you are talking to somebody in high pitch in a noisy railway station, which place would you prefer to talk or express your intimate emotions? Obviously, in the quiet room, you cannot shout your innermost feelings in a noisy railway station, unless the situation compels. It may be a deviation, but as a norm, generally people would like to sit in a calm, quiet environment when they want to open up. Classroom and bedroom. So, in a classroom, immediately you see a kind of formal situation, a power equation is going on. In bedroom, lot of formalities are broken, informal situation, equality is maintained. and then desert and beach. So, you can see the difference, how a person's psyche will be there in desert. Let us say it is sweating, the environment is very unfriendly, it is humid, and one is very thirsty, and one is near the beach, and then let us say it is a very cool breeze and it is a very cool environment against the hot environment in the previous one. It automatically changes the psychic perception of the person. The environment intrudes into the mind and determines the communication message. Again, snow mountain, such as if you go to Himalayas, whereas polluted crowded road. Now, when you are in the snow mountain, no pollution, and then you breathe freely, and then you take soulful of the air, and then in the crowded polluted place you put a handkerchief on your nose, you hide your nose, you try to reduce the pollution intake, and the communication varies actually. So, here in the snow mountain scenario, you are again likely to open up, or again likely to think very philosophical thoughts, write poetry, express yourself more openly and freely. To go with the environmental context again, how we see our physical world around us is very much influenced by our individual psychological perceptions, which in turn are shaped by culture. Look at this, how we see our physical world around us is very much influenced by our individual psychological perceptions, which in turn are shaped by culture. So, people project their culturally bound mental perceptions onto the physical environment. So, they have certain perceptions which is coming from their environment and they project it on the other. This can also lead to some kind of cultural conflicts. So, even physical environment is subject to cultural interpretation. Physical environment has a considerable impact on our communication. So, for instance, look at a culture that is tolerant of smokers in crowd, and look at a culture that says that you cannot smoke in public and you have a smokers zone. So, you go there and smoke, but you have no right to pollute the public environment. You can be given privacy and you form your own group and you are allowed to do that there. So, the perception, so in some cultural situation environment they do not feel, they do not mind being passive smokers, it is so crowded and people are allowed to smoke and so on. Now, before I conclude, I would like to talk about more on certain other aspects of environment, how environment itself will determine and decide communication. And if you look at, for instance, the mall space, and how do you interact with people in mall space and how do you interact with people in closed coffee shops, let us see. So, it makes lot of difference. Now, I will just make you think about this, think about how our communication varies when the environment changes, and let us focus on this more in the next lecture, and then towards the end of it I will try to give you more tips on overcoming some of the conflicts which will come because of these variables. So, just think over these aspects, particularly the environmental aspect, revise the lectures which I have given so far, and in the next one, hopefully the final one, we will be concluding this topic. So, until then, thank you and bye.